It's a little bit like panning for gold, except you've got an abundance of it, and it's not nearly as valuable. Jack says, there's more where that came from. We start in a horse stall at mucking time for a reason. Actually, a couple of reasons. The mucking job itself concerns winnowing usable wood shavings, absorbent, clean mostly, from waste, the excretions of a horse. And perhaps that process serves as a metaphor for our task. In our lives, we separate truth from falsehood, and we hope that we can discount falsehood effectively. In some sense, when we talk about misinformation, we're talking about, excuse the term, horseshit, or to use the term more widely used, bullshit. It's almost become a philosophical term. Harry Frankfurt, an emeritus professor of philosophy at Princeton, has studied the phenomenon, and his little book on bullshit that appeared in 2005 was on the New York Times bestseller list for a while. It's a very quick read of only 67 very short pages.
I was trained as an analytic philosopher, and analytic philosophy is characterized by a special concern for clarification of concepts. And this was a concept that seemed to me to be an important one. It referred to a significant feature of our culture, and not only a significant feature, but a feature that, in my view, posed certain dangers to the foundations of civilization.
So what is your theory of bullshit? What is bullshit?
Well, it consists in a lack of concern for the difference between truth and falsity. The motivation of the bullshitter is not to say things that are true or even to say things that are false, but he's serving some other purpose. And the question of whether what he says is true or false is really irrelevant to his pursuit of that ambition. The bullshitter is not necessarily a liar. What he says may very well be true, and he may not think that it's false. I was careful to try to make a distinction between, make clear the differences, as I understand it, between bullshitters and liars.
As an aside, I have to admit that I am very amused to hear a serious philosopher from Princeton say the words bullshit and bullshitter in conversation with an academic book publisher. But the interviewer asked the right question for us. What is bullshit? Frankfurt points up a difference between lies and bullshit. The lie can be refuted and disproven. Bullshit can't be countered in that way. The liar understands the difference between truth and falsity. The bullshitter doesn't regard truth at all. The claims of bullshit are not made for the sake of truth value, but they have other purposes. And Frankfurt even says that the bullshitter may even believe that his or her bullshit is true. Another difference. While lies are utterances, they're said aloud or they're written. Bullshit can be performed and enacted. Frankfurt cites fellow philosopher Max Black, who used the more genteel word humbug to discuss bullshit. Black identifies humbug not only as a category of speech, Frankfurt writes, but as a category of action as well. It can be accomplished by words or by deeds. I don't want to dwell too much on the colorful vocabulary, since we're turning now to misinformation and our complex relationship with technology. Misinformation is harder to sniff out than perhaps it once was because of the ways that we now use technology to promulgate it. Probably first and foremost, Misinformation and technology have merged in social media and generally on the web with a mind boggling scale. It's big, it's sprawling, and it's hard to get a handle on. Duke's Bill Adair says when he describes misinformation on the internet.
I remember when we just on the dawn of the internet age, thinking how marvelous the internet was going to be. It was going to empower everyone. It was going to bring information to everyone. It was going to be great for journalism, and here we are 20 years later, and we just see in every corner of the world, in every corner of our lives, that there is just so much misinformation, and it pops up in really insidious ways, and it's really scary. And so we've really here at Duke been working on several different aspects of that. The most recent one on fake videos, like the one surfaced over the weekend, involved that another video that suggested that Nancy Pelosi was drunk. And these are things that are not expensive to make, that are not like these deep fakes that we all hear are coming. But this is increasingly the way that misinformation is being spread. So it's big, it's sprawling, it's hard to get a handle on, and it's frightening what it can do to our lives.
Absolutely. The scale of misinformation comes in part from the fact that misinformation is cheap to create and distribute on the web and through social media. As a form of marketing in a mostly Wild West media landscape, misinformation may also appeal to people with something to gain in changing minds or forcing decisions. A danger, as Frankfurt pointed out, is the devaluation of truth itself, which can itself also be a motivation, though certainly a nihilistic one, to use misinformation. In an interview with Michael Lewis, the author of Moneyball and Liar's Poker, Steve Bannon said, "The Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit." It's difficult to clean a stall when there's more manure than there is usable sawdust. At the very beginning of this course, I outlined some of the social and political dislocations that took place when printing technology emerged in Europe. The technology then changed the way that information was exchanged, and the structures that controlled information no longer applied, or at least were no longer effective. Scholars have viewed the Protestant Reformation and labor movements as in some way consequences of developments in printing technology. The result over the decades and extending even into centuries was that policies and constraints were set into place, in part to support the old regimes, of course, but also to create accountability and ways of validating claims. The kinds of political and regulatory frameworks that shape publishing are now sketchy or lacking for social media platforms. Probably just as important, cultural and social sensibilities about conduct on social media also seems rather diffuse. Can technology itself, in AI systems for example, be used to combat misinformation on social media technologies? What are the stakes of controls or the lack of controls? How have economics underlying new technologies changed the nature and the viability of traditional sources of information? Misinformation is in many ways just old news. It's been around probably as long as there's been language or gesture or society. The ways that misinformation have been spread has changed. And along with the changes have come different ways of attempting to keep misinformation in check. We'll be looking at two forms of misinformation in particular: medical misinformation and, after Election Day, misinformation in politics. Our class guests will help us out. The topic that we're diving into is misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I've been doing is sort of reading around, and it's easy to paint horror stories with misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to sort of move beyond those because everybody understands that that happens. But what do you do about it? And I read a law review article that said here's basically what can be done, and it listed probably 6 things, and they were the 6 usual suspects that seemed to me to be just part and parcel of good communications. Um, I do think that there are complications, and I mentioned in my email earlier today to you, and that is that I think that we've shifted the way that we get information. And social media has played much larger a role. And I think that it's placed additional requirements on people to winnow through what they hear. And, we have, in a sense, been privileged by having fairly responsible editorial staffs that take on that role, and that those seem to be falling away as a result, I think, of technology. And I'm just wondering what you think about this in terms of scientific communications. How do we today manage and clarify what scientists are up to, their relevance within society, and what tools do scientists have to combat misinformation? And I guess that's the whole topic right there. And if you want, just sort of go on a riff.
Well, you're you're not asking easy questions, right? You're asking questions that don't really have good answers. But I think that when I present social media as a tool for science communication in my SciComm class, one of the points that I make is that the first point I make is there's no obligation on your part as a scientist to even use social media to communicate science. I think a lot of younger scientists embrace it because they've, social media has been a part of their life for much of their life. And I think they feel pretty comfortable with it, but certainly older scientists, and even surprising to me sometimes, some of the younger scientists I work with in my courses and my workshops don't necessarily embrace social media for various reasons. They don't have the time. They don't entirely trust it. They've seen the ways it can go bad, and they're wary of that, or they just in their minds sort of partition it so that social media is for friends and family, and they don't see it as a scientific tool. And so one of the first things I try to tell them is, my goal is not to convince them that they have to use social media to communicate science, and that they shouldn't feel guilty or pressured to do it. But I present the flip side, which is here's the reasons to consider it. And I explore both the positive outcomes and the potential negative outcomes. But one of the points I try to make is that more than ever before, it's a way to communicate directly to the public and be the messenger of your science. And I think people see the value in that. I think that they see it more as a tool to communicate throughout the science community. I'd say a higher percentage of scientists that I work with use it for that, to communicate throughout their scientific networks. But there are some people who embrace the opportunity to communicate directly to non-experts, non-scientists, and be the direct messenger. And I've seen some really effective uses of social media for that. But at the end of the day, I feel like the problem that we are facing right now, for example, with the pandemic and miscommunication, is less about the tool and more about the climate we're in, which is, anyone who uses social media has always known the potential risks and rewards of it. I think what's different is that we're in such a polarized environment now, and a big percentage of the public is allowing this to be politicized, and so masks are a perfect example of this. How did they become politicized? How do you explain this? It's the message was bungled from the beginning. I think it wasn't in the early stages of the pandemic. I don't think science communicators did a good job of communicating the actual message that should be out there about masks, which was that the top priority at that point had to be getting them to the frontline healthcare providers, and and after that, let's explore the effective use of masks and the limitations and the strengths and all of that. But the message was sent out and then grabbed a hold of and politicized, which is that masks are bad, they shouldn't be worn. And that's not the message that should have been put out there, obviously. The message should have been, we need to come up with priorities for how we allocate these. So I think that was just an example of bad communication. And then, of course, once it was sort of bungled and put out there in the wrong way, then, political forces grabbed a hold of that for an agenda that really didn't have anything to do with science and everything to do with controlling people's thoughts in general about politics. That's where it got out of control. So, I can help scientists come up with strategies for using social media effectively to communicate science communication. I'm absolutely stymied when it comes to how to combat the politicization of science. And I don't know, you told me to go on a riff and I'm instead rambling. I don't know that any of this makes sense, but
actually, what you've said really squares with what I've read. One of the little books that I think you may be getting my little daily dispatches, but
yeah,
one of the books that I've been looking at is On Bullshit by Harry Frankfurt.
yeah,
And it's interesting because he makes the distinction between the liar and the bullshitter, and says in one of the videos that's on YouTube that the bullshitter doesn't really have any concern for the truth or falsity of the statements because that's not really where the agenda lies.
yeah,
Whereas a liar understands that there is a difference between truth and falsity and that it matters.
yeah,
And I think that he also points out that you can fight lies by arguing against it, by refuting it, by lining up evidence, because basically you're on the same page with the liar and that truth is recognized by both parties. Whereas with the bullshitter, that really doesn't even work because it isn't really part of the discussion at all. And I think that kind of plays in to what you just said.
well, yeah, and I think that the people who are sort of embracing this idea that masks, that we shouldn't wear masks, and I mean, I keep coming back to this example, but and that they're embracing that not because of any thoughts about the science behind it, but entirely because that narrative allows them it's confirmation bias, and it confirms their larger bias, which has nothing to do with science and everything to do with this idea that the government is trying to control them and manipulate them and make them weak, and so just say no to that, right? And that's you can't argue science when their argument is not actually based in science at all, but based in whatever Trump says is just another excuse for them to entrench themselves in this notion that there's an us and them, and that this is playing into exactly what their fear or paranoia is about government trying to control them and all of that. So I could show them all the data in the world, and it's not going to affect their viewpoint at all. And so that's kind of where I was going with my previous riff or ramble, was that social media makes it a little bit easier to get that message out there and to reinforce their biases and those sorts of things. But I don't think, it's kind of like don't blame the messenger, right? That's just a vehicle. And if it weren't social media, it would be something else, and it may not spread as rapidly, but it would be people stapling flyers on telephone poles, or the town crier or whatever it is. It may not spread as rapidly. And I think that's part of the pathology of all this, is that it does spread more rapidly. But, my message to my students about social media is it's just a tool. It's just a vehicle. And it's more about what is the message that you're spreading through that tool or vehicle. That's the thing that comes up over and over from day one in my class till the very last day, and almost every day in between. What is your message? Who's your audience? Those are kind of the two recurring themes over and over. What's your message? Who's your audience? And and so social media is just a very convenient and effective and rapid tool for spreading a message that in this case has really nothing to do with science and everything to do with confirming their own biases about power structures and things like that.
The thing that comes to mind too, and you actually are of a generation that could probably appreciate this. There had been a time when media was much more of a monolith. And I recall reading a book when I was in college that was called Warming Fires by a guy named Sellers. And he was interested in American community. And he basically said that Americans all over the continent would gather together in sort of ritualistic fashion around the warming fire of Walter Cronkite doing the news.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because that that kind of ritual played out within the discussions about the Vietnam War, for example, that the agendas and the facts were something that was shared across the community. People didn't agree with methods, they didn't agree with the perspectives, but there was a commonality of fact, even though some of the facts were doubtlessly wrong.
Yeah.
But I think that what we have in social media now is a splintering of those common rituals. We have no warming fires that we all gather around. And I think that complicates the whole approach that we take when we begin to try to combat misinformation. You can probably hear my macaws in the background.
I was going to ask, are those actual birds that I hear?
Those are birds. It's Bert and Zuzu. They have actually made contributions to the class.
I was wondering if your students are just used to hearing that by now.
That's why if you look at my missive from today, you'll see that there's a picture of Zuzu because they wanted to see it.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah. So the warming fires concept is an interesting one. I'll say two things really quickly. One is I sort of agree with you, but rather than saying there's no warming fire that we all gather around, I would say the problem is there's now several warming fires. There's the Fox News warming fire and the NPR warming fire, and this 24-hour news cycle and this process of cable and 500 channels and unlimited websites creates, you pick it, whatever warming fire makes you feel best, so I think that's the real problem is if I felt like there were no warming fire, then I feel like, well, maybe we just need the right messenger to come along and create that fire, and then we could unite people again. But I think it's so splintered and polarized right now because there are so many different fires. But what you said is really interesting, because one of my classes, I always talk about sort of why is it that the public struggles to accept science sometimes. And I talk about confirmation biases, and things like that. But I also show data where, and you've probably seen this before, you're familiar with it, where they have a number of sort of professions or institutions, and going back to the 1950s, they look at how like public trust in these institutions. And so one is the military, and one is the science community, and one is the law enforcement community, and one is the media, and one is Congress and the political community. And you could kind of predict that what you see in these things. The military is generally pretty highly respected and trusted by the public, except you see these sort of predictable dips like during the Vietnam War, things like that. Congress has consistently been pretty low. But one of the things that surprised, and science, by the way, is always consistently at or near the top with no dips. And that's the good news, is that the public since the 1950s has generally respected and appreciated what scientists do and contribute to society. Now, we may be at the beginning of a dip, right? So we may look back in 10 years and say the pandemic was the beginning of the first dip that that was really significant. We'll have to wait and see. But what always surprises my students is that the one that I make sure to point out to them, because they're all in their mid-20s, is that the media used to be up there near the top. right? And now, of course, the media is down there at the bottom with Congress. But I tell them there was a time, and I vaguely remember this, when there were three news channels and three old white guys with gray hair that were trusted, paternal figures that everyone in the country trusted, and you just picked which one you wanted to listen to on any given night. But it's shocking for students to hear that there was a time when the media were really trusted and respected by the public, because that's so long gone now, and it's so fractionated and polarized. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this, other than that it's interesting to me to remind ourselves, guys your age and my age, that not everybody remembers that time when people trusted the media and felt like that was a source of good information.
I'm hoping that we, as a culture and as a society, can create new norms, new practices, a new sense of etiquette, in a sense, to be able to make social media much more of a communication between groups, as a means of communication in a broader sense, rather than as the echo chambers that so often it feels like. Do you know of any initiatives in that regard? Are there things that can be done that may ease people's qualms about media, and that may, in a sense, civilize or reconstruct social media to make it much more of a communications medium that is broad?
I don't know of anything, which is not to say that there aren't efforts out there to do that, but mostly what I see is people basically just repeating, or I'm repeating what they say, or they're repeating what I just said, which is analyzing the problem and where we are and how we got here. I don't know that anyone feels like they've come up with a solution for this yet. I mean, short of something that would never, I hope, happen, and that would be really draconian, like banning social media, and going back to the days of a non 24-hour news cycle and no Fox News, and and just sort of. But I mean, obviously, that I'm not advocating for that at all. I feel like the genie's out of the bottle, and social media are here to stay, and the internet is here to stay, and the alternative obviously is worse, which is some sort of totalitarian government that controls the media, which I think is, would be okay with Trump. But I don't think anyone's actually, other than him, is advocating for that. But I told you my thought on sort of social media being more of a vehicle than a culprit. What are your thoughts on that? Do you agree or disagree? I'm curious.
I'm very suspicious of it, and I guess that I think about it in terms of its sort of formal characteristics, not even in terms of its audience. I think the audience is fractured. It's easy to pick and choose what voice you want to listen to. But the thing that bothers me about, say, Twitter, is that I find it very difficult to have a nuanced kind of discussion in 280 characters. And I know that people, have these extensive threads, but it just seems to me like scratching your elbow from behind your back. It's an odd way of trying to communicate. And I think that people do that because they feel that they have the audience there.
Yeah.
There are some scientists that seem to be able to pull this off pretty well. I do follow Eric Topol, who's
I do as well.
I mean, and he handles things quite, I think, elegantly, in that when you look at his tweets, a lot of times they are directly related to a publication that he's highlighted, and then the comments are short and sweet, but there's a context there.
Yeah.
There's an art to this, and I haven't figured out how to be artistic.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really interesting. I've noticed much more in the last year or two these extensive threads that people are, where people will go on a rant about something. And I've never been a power user of Twitter. I have a Twitter account. I tweet from time to time, but mostly it's either when I'm really pissed at the government or when I do it for professional reasons. It's mostly just announcements about upcoming seminars or workshops. You know, I rarely, you know, I don't use it to have ongoing dialogues with people, and I don't have a lot of followers, so I wouldn't expect that. But my recollection is that in the earlier days of Twitter, these threads were sort of looked at dismissively, and I think the purists in the early days of Twitter felt like it was creating a thread with 10 tweets in a row was cheating in a way. You know, I mean, I think people bought into the idea that this medium is about, you know, communicating effectively in 140 characters, which it originally was, you know, and then 280 or whatever. But I think people felt like if you did a thread of 10 tweets in a row, you were sort of cheating and sidestepping what was supposed to be the intention of it. And that has totally changed. And now I see people doing these threads all the time. And I don't think that's why I don't think that was the original intention of Twitter.
Yeah.
You know, I think there was, as much as it could be frustrating, I think there was sort of an ethic around really adhering to that notion that if you couldn't say it in 140 characters, this was the wrong medium for you, you know?
Yeah. I likened it, I remember likening it to writing haiku, in that, you know, you had this formal structure that you had to adhere to. And in a sense, the tweets were supposed to explore the possibilities of the medium itself, just as haiku is sort of an exploration of that form.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm kind of a literary person in many ways, and that's probably the minority view.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if you feel like you've noticed the same thing, but I do feel like you're not as stigmatized for having a 10 tweet thread now as you used to be. It used to be that if you did that, you were somehow lesser than, you know, because you couldn't manage to say it all in 140 characters. And now it's, I think, you know, whether it's this general notion that rules don't matter anymore, or that standards don't matter as much anymore, or people just feel like they're so much angrier and have so much more to say that they don't care if they're breaking, you know, violating standards. They just want to say what they need to say. But I mean, none of that's really my biggest problem with Twitter as a communication medium. The reason that I sometimes don't like Twitter is because I feel that it can be a tremendous tool for getting information out there, but I feel like a lot of times it's just a way for people to reveal the worst of themselves, you know?